The desert wind carried dust and the scent of sage across the small settlement of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory. The year was 1887, and the town existed on the edge of civilization, where the railroad's iron fingers had not yet reached. Adobe buildings lined a single main street, their walls baked golden by the relentless sun that beat down from a cloudless sky. Marshal Jake Sullivan stood on the wooden porch of his office, his weathered hands resting on the grip of his Colt .45. At 43, his face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much violence and too little justice. His steel-gray eyes watched as a lone rider approached from the east, kicking up a small cloud of red dust behind his horse. The stranger was tall and lean, sitting his paint horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. He wore a black hat pulled low over his eyes, and a leather duster that had seen better days. As he drew closer, Jake could see the man's face was deeply tanned, with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. There was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of danger, like a rattlesnake coiled in the shade. "Afternoon, Marshal," the stranger called out as he reined in his horse before the jail. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of authority. "Afternoon," Jake replied, not moving from his position. "Don't believe I know you, friend." The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the dusty ground. "Name's Thomas Blackwood. I'm looking for a man named Carlos Mendez. Heard he might be in these parts." Jake's jaw tightened. Carlos Mendez was trouble, a Mexican outlaw who had been rustling cattle and robbing stages throughout the territory. The man had a reputation for ruthlessness that extended far beyond the border. "Mendez, you say?" Jake stepped down from the porch, his hand never leaving his gun. "What business you got with him?" Blackwood's dark eyes met Jake's steadily. "Personal business, Marshal. The kind that ends with one of us in the ground." Before Jake could respond, a commotion erupted from the other end of town. A young woman came running down the street, her long brown hair streaming behind her, her blue dress torn and dusty. It was Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher, and Jake could see the terror in her eyes even from a distance. "Marshal Sullivan," she cried, stumbling as she reached them. "They've taken the children." A group of men. They rode into the schoolhouse and took 6 of the children. Jake caught her as she nearly collapsed, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. "Easy there, Sarah. Take your time. Tell me what happened." Sarah's chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath. There were 8 of them, maybe 9. Mexican men, well armed. Their leader. He had a gold tooth and a scar across his nose. He said they were taking the children to Devil's Canyon, and if the town wanted them back, we'd have to bring them $10,000 in gold by sunset tomorrow. Jake's blood ran cold. Devil's Canyon was a box canyon about 15 miles north of town, a place where the Apache had once made their final stand against the cavalry. It was treacherous country, perfect for an ambush. "Did you recognize any of them?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The leader, when he smiled, I saw that gold tooth, and the way the others deferred to him." Sarah's voice trailed off, but Jake understood. "Carlos Mendez," Jake said grimly. Blackwood stepped forward, his face hard as granite. "How many children?" 6, Sarah whispered. "The youngest is only 7 years old. Little Emma Patterson, and her brother Billy, who's 9. Then there's the Rodriguez twins, Maria and Jose, they're 10. And the Henderson boys, Sam and David, 12 and 14. Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. As the only law in Copper Creek, these people looked to him for protection. But he was just one man, and Mendez had at least 8 riders with him. "Marshal," Blackwood said quietly, "I know you don't know me from Adam, but I'm offering my help. Those children don't deserve to pay for whatever grievance Mendez has with this town." Jake studied the stranger's face, looking for any sign of deception. What he saw instead was a man who had made hard choices and lived with the consequences. There was pain in those dark eyes, the kind that came from losing something precious. "You know how to handle yourself in a fight?" Jake asked. "I've had practice," Blackwood replied simply. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Jake knew they had maybe an hour of good light left. Not enough time to reach Devil's Canyon before nightfall. We'll need to wait until first light, Jake said. Riding into that canyon in the dark would be suicide. What about the children? Sarah asked desperately. They must be terrified. Mendez won't hurt them, Jake said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. They're no good to him dead. But Sarah, you need to understand something. This town doesn't have $10,000 in gold. Even if we emptied every safe and strongbox, we might come up with half that. Sarah's face paled. Then what are we going to do? Jake looked at Blackwood, then back at Sarah. We're going to get those children back, but we're going to do it our way. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jake and Blackwood walked toward the saloon to gather what men they could find who were willing to ride into hell itself. Behind them, Sarah Mitchell sank to her knees in the dust, her hands clasped in prayer for the children who would spend the night in the hands of outlaws. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of violence and the hope of redemption. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice echoing across the vast emptiness of the Arizona Territory. The Copper Creek saloon buzzed with nervous energy as Jake and Blackwood pushed through the batwing doors. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey, and conversations died as the two men entered. Behind the bar, Irish Mike O'Malley polished glasses with mechanical precision, his usually jovial face grave with concern. "Boys," Jake called out, his voice cutting through the silence. "By now you've all heard about the children. I'm looking for volunteers to ride out at dawn." The silence stretched uncomfortably. These were hard-working men, miners, cattlemen, shopkeepers, but they weren't gunfighters. They had families of their own to think about. Finally, old Pete Hennessy, the town's blacksmith, stood up from his table. His massive frame cast a shadow across the room, and his arms, muscled from years at the forge, crossed over his chest. "I'll ride with you, Marshal," Pete said in his thick Irish accent. "My youngest goes to that school. Could have been him taken today." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and gradually, 4 more men stood up. There was Doc Martinez, the town's physician, who despite his profession knew how to handle a rifle. Young Tommy Fletcher, barely 19 but steady with a gun. Ben Carter, a cattleman whose spread lay north of town. And surprisingly, Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who served the small Mexican community in Copper Creek. "Father," Jake said, surprised, "this isn't work for a man of God." The priest's dark eyes flashed with determination. "Marshal, 2 of those children are from my parish, Maria and Jose Rodriguez. Their parents are beside themselves with worry. Sometimes a man of God must take up arms to protect the innocent." Jake nodded, understanding the priest's conviction. "That makes 7 of us, against at least 8 of Mendez's men." "Not good odds," Ben Carter observed grimly. "No." Blackwood spoke for the first time since entering the saloon. "But it's not about the odds. It's about doing what's right." Irish Mike set down his glass and leaned forward. "What's your story, stranger? Why are you so willing to risk your neck for children you don't even know?" Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his whiskey glass. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every man in the room heard him. "I had a daughter once. She was 8 years old, with yellow hair and eyes blue as a summer sky. Her name was Catherine." He paused, and Jake saw the pain flicker across his face. "She was taken by men like Mendez. By the time I found her." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a silence of understanding and shared purpose. "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly. "So am I," Blackwood replied. "But being sorry doesn't bring her back. Maybe saving these children will give her death some meaning." Doc Martinez leaned forward. "What do you know about Devil's Canyon?" Jake spread a rough map on the table, weighing down the corners with whiskey bottles. "It's a box canyon, about 3 miles long and maybe half a mile wide at its mouth. The walls are steep, 100 feet or more in most places. There's only one way in and one way out." "Sounds like a trap," Tommy Fletcher said nervously. "It is," Jake agreed. "But it's also a fortress. Mendez chose it because he knows we can't get to him easily. But that also means he can't get out easily either. What about the Apache? Ben Carter asked. I heard they still consider that canyon sacred ground. Father Santos nodded gravely. The Apache call it the place of crying spirits. It was where Chief Cochise's son made his last stand against the cavalry in 1876. Many warriors died there. The Apache won't interfere, Jake said. They've moved north, following the game. But we need to be careful. There are plenty of places for snipers to hide in those rocks. Blackwood studied the map intently. What about water? If we can't take the canyon by force, maybe we can wait them out. There's a spring in the back of the canyon, Jake replied. That's probably why Mendez chose it. He can hold out for days if he has to. Then we have to go in, Pete Hennessy said flatly. Those children can't wait days. Jake looked around the table at the faces of the men who had volunteered to ride with him. They were good men, brave men, but they weren't soldiers. Most had never been in a gunfight. Against Mendez's experienced outlaws, some of them wouldn't be coming home. I want everyone to understand what we're facing, Jake said seriously. Carlos Mendez is a killer. He's been robbing and murdering across the territory for 3 years. His men are hardened outlaws who won't hesitate to put a bullet in you. If any of you want to back out, now's the time. None of the men moved. All right then, Jake said. We leave at first light. Everyone needs to be armed and ready. Bring extra ammunition and whatever food you can carry. This might take a while. As the men began to file out of the saloon, making their preparations for the morning, Blackwood remained seated at the table, staring at the map. You got a plan? Jake asked. I'm working on it, Blackwood replied. Tell me about the approach to the canyon. Are there any places where we can get close without being seen? Jake traced a route on the map with his finger. There's an old Apache trail that runs along the eastern ridge. It's narrow and dangerous, but it might give us a way to get above them. What about a distraction? Something to draw their attention while a small group gets into position. Jake smiled grimly. I think I might have an idea about that. Outside, the desert night was cold and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. In houses throughout Copper Creek, parents held their remaining children a little closer, whispering prayers for the safe return of the 6 who had been taken. In the small adobe house where Sarah Mitchell lived alone, the schoolteacher sat by her window, staring out at the desert and thinking about her students. And somewhere in the darkness, in a canyon 15 miles away, 6 frightened children huddled together around a small fire, wondering if anyone would come to save them. The wind picked up, rattling the windows of the town and carrying with it the scent of rain from the distant mountains. By morning, the storm would be upon them, and with it, the reckoning that had been building since Carlos Mendez first set foot in Arizona territory. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Arizona desert, with heavy clouds gathering in the western sky. The promised storm was moving in faster than expected, and Jake knew they would have to move quickly if they wanted to avoid being caught in the open during a flash flood. The 7 men gathered at the edge of town, their horses stamping nervously in the pre-dawn chill. Each man carried a rifle and extra ammunition, along with enough food and water for a day in the desert. The weight of their mission hung heavy in the air, unspoken but understood by all. Jake checked his Winchester one final time, then swung up into the saddle. Remember, we stick to the plan. Blackwood and I will take the Apache trail and try to get above them. The rest of you will approach from the mouth of the canyon. When you hear my signal, 3 rifle shots, you open fire and keep them pinned down. What if something goes wrong? Doc Martinez asked. Then we improvise, Jake replied grimly. But no matter what happens, we don't leave without those children. The ride to Devil's Canyon took them through some of the most desolate country in Arizona territory. The landscape was a study in browns and reds, with scattered stands of prickly pear cactus and ocotillo breaking the monotony of the desert floor. Ancient mesas rose like monuments to forgotten gods, their flat tops shrouded in the gathering storm clouds. As they rode, Father Santos fell in beside Jake. Marshal, I've been thinking about what Blackwood said last night. About his daughter. What about it? A man carrying that much pain. Sometimes it makes him reckless. Sometimes it makes him dangerous. Jake glanced ahead to where Blackwood rode point, his figure straight and purposeful in the saddle. Maybe. But right now, dangerous is what we need. They reached the outskirts of Devil's Canyon just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The massive rock formations loomed before them like the gates of hell, carved by wind and water over countless centuries. The canyon mouth yawned wide and dark, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. Jake called a halt and dismounted, pulling out his field glasses to study the terrain. Through the lenses, he could see smoke rising from somewhere deep within the canyon. Mendez's camp. There was no sign of movement, but Jake knew the outlaws would have sentries posted. There, Blackwood said quietly, pointing to a thin wisp of smoke near the canyon mouth. Lookout post. Jake adjusted his glasses and spotted the sentry, a Mexican in a wide-brimmed hat, partially concealed behind a boulder. The man was alert, his rifle ready, but his attention seemed focused on the main approach to the canyon. "Can you take him?" Jake asked. Blackwood nodded, already sliding his rifle from its scabbard. "Give me 5 minutes to get into position." Jake watched as Blackwood melted into the landscape, moving with the fluid grace of a man who had spent years hunting dangerous prey. The stranger seemed to become part of the desert itself, invisible among the rocks and scrub brush. The rain was falling steadily now, creating small rivulets that ran down the canyon walls. In the distance, thunder rumbled ominously, promising a more serious storm to come. A single rifle shot echoed from the canyon mouth, sharp and final. Jake waited, counting heartbeats, until Blackwood's figure reappeared among the rocks, waving them forward. "One down," Pete Hennessy muttered. "7 to go," Jake replied. They moved closer to the canyon, using the rocks for cover. The Apache trail that Jake had mentioned was little more than a series of handholds and footholds carved into the eastern wall of the canyon. It would be a treacherous climb, especially in the rain, but it was their only chance of getting above Mendez's position. Jake divided the group as planned. Doc Martinez would lead Ben Carter, Tommy Fletcher, and Father Santos in a frontal approach, while Pete Hennessy would circle around to cover the canyon mouth and prevent any escape. Jake and Blackwood would take the Apache trail and try to reach the rim above the outlaw camp. "Give us 30 minutes," Jake told the others. "Then move in. And remember, those children are in there. Watch your shots." The climb up the Apache trail was harrowing. The ancient handholds were slick with rain, and more than once Jake felt his boots slip on the wet rock. Behind him, Blackwood climbed with steady determination, his face set in lines of grim concentration. Halfway up the wall, Jake paused to rest and check their progress. Below, he could see the other members of their group moving into position near the canyon mouth. The rain was coming down harder now, and he could hear the distant rumble of thunder growing closer. "We need to move," Blackwood said quietly. "This rain is going to bring flash floods. If we're caught in this canyon when the water comes." Jake nodded, understanding the danger. Desert flash floods were legendary in their power and speed. The dry washes that seemed so innocent could become raging torrents in a matter of minutes, carrying away everything in their path. They reached the rim of the canyon just as the full fury of the storm hit. Rain poured down in sheets, and lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, dramatic flashes. Below them, Jake could see Mendez's camp, a cluster of tents and a large fire pit where the outlaws were taking shelter under a canvas tarp. And there, huddled together near the fire, were the children. Jake's heart clenched as he saw them. They looked so small and vulnerable, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. Little Emma Patterson was crying silently, her brother Billy's arm around her shoulders. The Rodriguez twins sat close together, their eyes wide with terror. The Henderson boys were trying to be brave, but Jake could see the fear in their young faces. 8 men, Blackwood whispered, pointing out the outlaws. "Mendez is the big one by the fire. Gold tooth, scar across his nose, just like the schoolteacher said." Jake studied the layout of the camp. The outlaws had chosen their position well. They had clear fields of fire in all directions, and the canyon walls provided excellent cover. But they had also trapped themselves. If Jake and Blackwood could create enough chaos from above, the others might be able to get close enough to rescue the children. "There," Jake said, pointing to a pile of loose rocks near the edge of the rim. "If we can start a rock slide, it might give us the distraction we need." Blackwood nodded, already moving toward the rocks. Together, they began to work, prying loose the larger stones and positioning them near the edge. The rain made the work difficult, but it also masked the sound of their movements. Below, Carlos Mendez stood up from his position by the fire, his eyes scanning the canyon walls. Jake froze, afraid they had been spotted, but the outlaw leader's attention seemed focused on something else entirely. "Oh yes, eso," Mendez called out to his men. "Do you hear that?" Jake strained his ears and heard it too, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It took him a moment to realize what it was. Water. A flash flood was coming down the canyon. "Now!" Jake shouted, putting his shoulder against the pile of rocks. The rock slide thundered down the canyon wall, taking with it a cascade of smaller stones and debris. The outlaws scrambled for cover, shouting in Spanish and firing blindly at the canyon rim. In the chaos, Jake heard his own rifle shots, the signal for the others to attack. Gunfire erupted from the canyon mouth as Doc Martinez and his group opened fire on the outlaw camp. The children screamed in terror, huddling closer together as bullets whined overhead. But even as the battle raged, Jake could hear the approaching flood growing louder. The water was coming fast, and when it hit, it would sweep away everything in its path, outlaws, rescuers, and children alike. "We're out of time," Blackwood shouted over the din of gunfire and thunder. Jake looked down at the camp, where Mendez was rallying his men for a counterattack. The outlaw leader's gold tooth gleamed in the firelight as he grinned with savage pleasure, apparently oblivious to the danger approaching from up the canyon. The race was on. They had to get those children to safety before the floodwaters arrived. But first, they had to get through Carlos Mendez and his gang of killers. Jake levered a round into his Winchester and took careful aim. The final battle for Devil's Canyon was about to begin. The roar of the approaching flood filled the canyon like the voice of an angry god. Jake could see the wall of water rushing down the narrow gorge, carrying with it the debris of the desert, tumbleweeds, dead cattle, and the remnants of an old mining camp that had been caught in the flood's path. "The water!" Jake shouted down to the men fighting below, everyone to high ground. But his warning was lost in the chaos of the battle. Mendez's outlaws were putting up fierce resistance, their rifles spitting fire from behind the rocks that surrounded their camp. Doc Martinez and his group were pinned down near the canyon mouth, unable to advance or retreat. Blackwood was already moving, rappelling down the canyon wall with a rope they had found among the Apache handholds. His descent was controlled but rapid, and Jake could see the determination in his face as he dropped toward the outlaw camp. Jake followed, his boots skidding on the wet rock as he half climbed, half fell down the canyon wall. Behind him, the rumble of the flood grew louder with each passing second. The children were screaming now, their terror audible even over the gunfire. Emma Patterson had broken free from her brother's protective embrace and was running blindly toward the canyon wall, her small form silhouetted against the firelight. "Emma!" Jake shouted, but she couldn't hear him over the noise. A rifle cracked, and Jake saw one of Mendez's men, a thin Mexican with a gold earring, taking aim at the fleeing child. Time seemed to slow as Jake brought his Winchester to his shoulder, leading the target, just as his father had taught him years ago on the family ranch in Texas. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and the outlaw spun around, his shot going wide. He dropped to his knees, clutching his shoulder, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers. But there was no time to celebrate. The flood was less than a minute away, and the children were still in the path of the water. Blackwood had reached the canyon floor and was moving through the outlaw camp like an avenging angel. His twin Colts were in his hands, and Jake watched in amazement as the stranger moved with deadly precision, each shot finding its mark. 2 more outlaws fell before they realized the danger was among them. "Get to the children!" Jake shouted as he reached the bottom of the canyon wall. Mendez heard him and turned, his scarred face twisted with rage. The outlaw leader's rifle came up, aimed directly at Jake's chest. But before he could fire, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Carlos!" The outlaw leader spun around, his eyes widening in recognition. Father Santos stood at the edge of the firelight, his rifle trained on Mendez. But it wasn't the priest's weapon that held the outlaw's attention. It was his face. "Miguel," Mendez said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Miguel Santos? I thought you were dead." "I should be," the priest replied, his voice heavy with old pain. "After what you did to my village, to my family, I wanted to be dead." Jake stared in shock as the truth became clear. Father Santos wasn't just a priest. He was Miguel Santos, survivor of whatever atrocity had driven him to take holy orders. And Carlos Mendez was the man responsible. "You cost me everything," Santos continued, his rifle never wavering. "My wife, my children, my home. You burned it all." "Ancient history, my friend," Mendez said, but Jake could see the fear in his eyes. "That was a long time ago." "Not long enough," Santos replied. The flood hit the canyon with the force of a freight train. The wall of water was 8 feet high and moving at tremendous speed, carrying with it everything in its path. The outlaws' horses, tethered near the canyon wall, disappeared in an instant, swept away by the raging torrent. "The children!" Jake shouted, lunging toward the spot where the 6 youngsters were huddled together. But Blackwood was already there, gathering the children in his arms and pushing them toward higher ground. Emma Patterson clung to his neck, her small body shaking with terror. Billy Patterson and the Henderson boys helped carry the younger children, their faces set with determination beyond their years. The flood swept through the outlaw camp, extinguishing their fire and scattering their equipment. 3 of Mendez's men were caught in the water and swept away, their screams echoing off the canyon walls before being silenced by the roar of the flood. Mendez himself managed to reach a large boulder just as the water rushed past. He clung to the rock, his rifle lost in the torrent, his face pale with fear and fury. "This isn't over," he shouted over the noise of the flood. "I'll kill every one of you." But his threats were empty now. The flood had scattered his men and destroyed his camp. Of his original 8 followers, only 2 remained, and they were more concerned with saving their own lives than continuing the fight. Jake helped Blackwood get the children to safety on a ledge about 20 feet above the canyon floor. All 6 were accounted for, though they were wet, cold, and traumatized by their ordeal. Emma Patterson was still crying, but she was alive, and that was what mattered. "Is everyone all right?" Doc Martinez called from his position near the canyon mouth. The flood had cut off his group's retreat, but they were safe on higher ground. "We're fine," Jake called back. "The children are safe." But the danger wasn't over. The flood was beginning to recede, leaving behind a canyon floor covered in mud and debris. And somewhere in that wasteland, Carlos Mendez was still alive, still dangerous. Jake saw him first, a muddy figure crawling out from behind the boulder where he had taken refuge. The outlaw leader had lost his rifle, but he still had his pistol, and his eyes were filled with murderous rage. "Look out!" Jake shouted, but Mendez was already moving, his gun coming up to fire at the children on the ledge. The shot that echoed through the canyon didn't come from Mendez's pistol. It came from Father Santos's rifle, fired with steady hands and a steady heart. The bullet took Mendez in the chest, spinning him around and sending him sprawling in the mud. The outlaw leader tried to get up, tried to raise his gun for one final shot, but his strength was gone. He collapsed face first into the mud, his body still at last. Father Santos lowered his rifle, his face etched with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. "May God forgive us both," he whispered. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader dead and their situation hopeless, threw down their weapons and surrendered. The battle for Devil's Canyon was over. Jake made his way down to where the children waited, his heart heavy with relief and exhaustion. Emma Patterson ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his legs. "I want to go home," she whispered. "We all do, sweetheart," Jake replied, lifting her up. "We all do." The storm was passing, and shafts of sunlight were beginning to break through the clouds. In the distance, Jake could see the other members of their rescue party making their way toward the ledge, where the children waited. Blackwood stood apart from the others, his face turned toward the canyon wall, where they had made their desperate descent. Jake walked over to him, still carrying Emma. "You did good today," Jake said. "Those children are alive because of you." Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. "I keep thinking about Catherine, about what might have happened if someone had come for her in time." "You can't change the past," Jake said gently, "but you can change the future. You saved 6 lives today. That has to count for something." Blackwood nodded slowly. "Maybe it does." The journey back to Copper Creek was slow and difficult. The children were exhausted, and the adults were not much better. But as they crested the final hill and saw the town spread out below them, Jake felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the desert sun. The entire population of Copper Creek was waiting for them. Sarah Mitchell was the first to reach the children, gathering them in her arms and crying tears of joy and relief. Parents embraced their young ones, and even the hardest men in town wiped away tears they pretended not to shed. As the celebration continued around them, Jake found himself standing with Blackwood at the edge of the crowd. The stranger was preparing to leave, his horse saddled and his gear packed. "You don't have to go," Jake said. "Town could use a man like you." Blackwood shook his head. "I'm not built for staying in one place, Marshal. Too many ghosts. Maybe it's time to stop running from them." Blackwood considered this, then smiled, the first real smile Jake had seen from him. "Maybe it is, but not today." He swung up into the saddle, then looked down at Jake one final time. "Take care of those children, Marshal. They're the future." "Where will you go?" Jake asked. "West," Blackwood replied. "There's always trouble heading west." Jake watched as the stranger rode out of Copper Creek, disappearing into the desert from which he had emerged. Around him, the celebration continued, but Jake felt a sense of completion, as if a circle had been closed. The children were safe. The threat was ended. Justice had been served. In the distance, thunder rumbled again, but this time it was not the sound of approaching danger. It was the sound of new storms on the horizon, new challenges to face, new chances to do what was right. Jake Sullivan, Marshal of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, walked back toward his office, ready to face whatever came next. Behind him, the desert wind carried the scent of rain and the promise of tomorrow. The West was still wild, still dangerous, but on this day, in this place, good had triumphed over evil, and sometimes that was enough.